All right, I've got a good one for you today. We're going to go see these things called the Gosford glyphs. The Gosford glyphs. Do you believe it? Hieroglyphics in Australia. Egyptian hieroglyphics. Let's go have a look, eh?
If you haven't heard of the Gosford glyphs before, then you're in for quite the tale. If you have heard of them, as I'm sure many of you have, then you might want to watch this video anyway, as we're going to get into some of the new evidence and new analysis that's recently been done on the site, work that's happened in the fairly recent past, and work that draws some very interesting conclusions as to the authenticity of the site. This new analysis challenges all previous claims about the Gosford glyphs on both sides of the argument. The so-called Gosford glyphs are a set of carved ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that have been made into a remote sandstone outcropping in the central coast of New South Wales in Australia. They're named after the nearby township of Gosford. They're also known as the Cairong glyphs, after the traditional Aboriginal name for the region. The hieroglyphs themselves aren't particularly well made. They certainly don't show the skill that you'll find on the tombs of Egypt, but there are quite a lot of them, some roughly 300 different symbols, written high up on both sides of this protected and hard to find canyon in the bush. These glyphs have been surrounded by controversy since the site was first discovered. There are verified and documented accounts of this site back in the 1970s, but we also have anecdotal reports of the site going as far back as the early decades of the 1900s. Naturally, if you Google the Gosford glyphs or look it up on establishment websites like Wikipedia, they'll confidently report to you that they're nothing more than a hoax, a collection of random symbols, carved into rocks by some enthusiastic Australian pranksters that must have visited the Middle East at some point, perhaps soldiers returning from World War I. It turns out, however, that there is much more to the site than just a collection of random glyphs. A lot of the recent controversy surrounding the glyphs has to do with a translation that was made, I think, sometime in the early 2010s, at least as best as I can tell. And while this made the supposed prank a far more sophisticated one than simply a set of random symbols, this translation led to more questions than answers, and the accuracy of the translation and the credentials of the translator were, frankly, highly suspect. Ultimately, this translation, the one that you'll find when you Google the site, it's really all over the internet, it only seemed to provide more evidence that the glyphs were nothing more than an elaborate hoax. I have not been able to find any information that this widespread translation, the one you'll find all over the internet of the Gosford glyphs, has been verified or that it's been confirmed by any other source. However, in recent years, the Gosford glyphs has been the subject of significant new research and analysis by Egyptian experts, and a new translation of parts of the glyphs has been made. This translation is different to the earlier one, and it's been demonstrated publicly and quite literally, glyph by glyph, word by word, to be accurate. If you have access to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, you can follow along and do this translation for yourself. It's repeatable and provable, and these are the very best conditions for good science. This translation and the analysis of the glyphs themselves have led to some startling new conclusions. According to these experts, not only do the glyphs tell a coherent story, one that explains the crude nature of the work and the odd location to find evidence for ancient Egyptians, but it provides strong evidence for dating the work to a very different period of time than the one claimed by so many articles about it on the internet. If these claims and this story are true, then it could have far-reaching consequences for what we think we know about the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So, are the Gosford glyphs an enigmatic clue from our past? Or are they simply an elaborate hoax perpetrated on an all-too-willing public, and one that has been running for decades, if not a century at this point? I visited this interesting place myself over a couple of days in February of 2020, and I also put the call out on my channel to see if there was anyone interested in coming along to join me. So a big thank you to all the folks that did make the trip out to the glyphs to see it with me. You guys made the experience all the more enjoyable. The Gosford glyphs are not the easiest place in the world to find. Although there is a walking track nearby, they are well off any of the many trails in the area, and there's no signage indicating where to look. You have to do some reading up of some other first-hand accounts on the internet before you go. The glyphs are in a very well protected section of what is a large sandstone outcropping. The first day here we really struggled to find it, and we ended up climbing right to the top of the sandstone hill, past many similar sandstone outcroppings, and then we went back down over the other side of the hill, ultimately homing in on some GPS coordinates of the actual location. The entire area is remarkably beautiful natural bushland that thankfully wasn't affected by the recent fires in Australia. There are some wonderful colours in areas of eroded sandstone, and near the glyphs themselves there is a huge, gnarly old ghost gum, or maybe it's a bloodwood tree. I'm certainly no expert. All I can tell you is that it's a hell of an impressive tree. Even when you're in the general area of the glyphs, finding the glyphs themselves requires a bit of searching around for the entrance, and from a hoax perspective, it strikes me as a fairly obscure place to stage something like this. If I were trying to prank the public, I'd put my glyphs somewhere more visible. Let's get into the premise for the Gosford glyphs, based on the most recent translation work done by Yusuf and Muhammad. Much of the reasoning you'll hear for both the authenticity and the dating of the site is based on the technical nature of the Egyptian language itself, and the form of the glyphs used in this sandstone canyon. Like every other language, Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved over time. Particular symbols changed in style and form from the Old Kingdom through the Middle and New Kingdoms and into the Greek-Roman period, which was the end of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. It's also a tremendously complex language, one of the very hardest of written languages to study and understand. There are quite literally thousands of symbols representing various sounds, names, words, or concepts. It's not just a simple 26-character alphabet like English. Also, context matters. How these symbols are grouped can change their meaning into different words based on the other symbols that are around them. Hieroglyphs can be written horizontally or vertically, and in fact both styles are represented in the work at Gosford. Based on the style of the writing, with some glyphs contemporary with the New Kingdom and the Greek-Roman period, Yusuf and Muhammad date the site to roughly around 500 BC, but likely not any earlier than this. This is contrary to the common claims that you read on the internet about the Gosford glyphs that seek to date the site to the Old Kingdom time of around 2500 BC. And in fact, it's this claim of dating the site to the Old Kingdom that is the source for much of the debunking that's used against it. Quite correctly, Egyptologists and academics question this older translation that dates the site to the Old Kingdom, as they also identified certain glyphs that were only used in later periods. Given that the Gosford glyphs do in fact tell a coherent story, made up from a large collection of around 300 glyphs, for this to have been a prank would require much more than just some bored Australian larrikin or a motivated soldier returning from the war with photographs and thoughts of hieroglyphs. Bear in mind also that it wasn't until after 1915 that the first versions of Egyptian dictionaries were even available. Before that, it was probably maybe 50 or 100 people worldwide that had access to manuscripts or any other translation material to work with this ancient language. To put this so-called hoax together would require a full-blown savant or a talented professor of Egyptology with a lifetime of study behind them. Even then, as you'll see, there are many nuances in the carving of the Gosford glyphs that seem to rule out this possibility altogether. This nuance that's contained in the glyphs and the details of the full translation symbol by symbol is explained in depth by Yusuf and Muhammad in a 3-part documentary on the Chematology YouTube channel. There is also an accounting of their work in an academic paper written by Muhammad Ibrahim that you can find on academia.org. There are a couple of points from this paper and this video that are worth mentioning here. Firstly, for many hieroglyphs, there are several ways one can write them. Some have a very common, or you might say famous, way of writing, with rare and obscure variations being recorded here and there, like when the symbol is reversed or altered in some form. If you were a professor or an Egyptologist creating this prank, you would obviously use the common or more famous form of a particular glyph. What's interesting about Gosford is that we see the exact opposite happening with several of these glyphs, with the rarer or more obscure form of the hieroglyph being used, as shown in this excerpt from the academic paper. Secondly, and this might blow your mind a little when you think about it, in the videos on their channel, Yusuf mentions that some of the symbols they found at Gosford have only recently been added to Egyptian dictionaries, and some of them as recently as 2012. So understand what that means. That before 2012, the translation for a particular sign was simply not available in any hieroglyphic dictionary, yet we have verified accounts of the Gosford glyphs going back to the 1970s, as well as anecdotal accounts of them back to the early 1900s. How exactly does that work, assuming it's a prank? How can the premise of a prank account for symbols at Gosford that weren't even translated until this current decade that we're in now? If you are interested in the full blow-by-blow details of the translation, I'd highly recommend checking out the full 3-part video on the Chematology channel. Not that many people have seen these videos, and their channel only has 800 subs. It's both good content and I think it's important work, so please do take the time to subscribe to their channel and give them some support. There were 2 authors identified in the glyphs: Nejet Sobet, who was a sailor, and Netta Sobet, the chief sailor, likely the captain of one of the ships. The Sobet in their names is probably a reference to their profession, or to that particular group, a common way of writing one's name and profession together in ancient Egypt, in this case of sailors, and you can see the oar glyph in the names. This makes sense to me when you see the somewhat poor quality of the glyphs themselves. These are people that had a working knowledge of the language, but had likely never drawn or carved into stone. The Gosford glyphs tells a story about a fleet of ships that were heading north, returning to Egypt, that then ran into a very strong storm. They were forced to turn around, presumably back to Australia. The weather was so bad that the fleet was shipwrecked. Ships were capsized, flipped upside down, and most of the expedition died, with only a few survivors making it ashore. These survivors mentioned the local inhabitants of what they called Pinu land as having no deception, and they marked this location as the grave or the tomb for those that were killed. One of the authors thanked Horus for surviving the accident, and they called on their gods to hide the entrance to the graves, and they invoked eternal life for the deceased in the heritage of Egypt as their homeland. The images and the translation that you'll hear are sourced from both the academic paper and Yusuf and Muhammad's video on the Chematology channel. When converted more or less into plain English, the translation reads as follows, quote, "The ruler and the chief of the foreign land Pinu have no deception." End quote. This is pretty clearly to me a reference to both Australia as Pinu land and also to the locals living there, presumably Aboriginals. Quote, "When the storm and the north wind blow up again, captains turned around to the south." End quote. So this is referring to the direction they were sailing. They were obviously sailing to the north, and then there is a reference that they specifically returned to where they came from, and in this case to the south. So they were also returning to, I guess, where they were before that, which presumably was Australia. Quote, "The ships capsized, they turned over and were destroyed into pieces. We prayed to our gods for help, but many were killed." End quote. This basically tells you the story of what happened when they turned around and the story of the storm. They called out to their gods for help. That's what the praise glyph is. This is normal behavior for people and religious cultures like the Egyptians. When bad stuff happens, you ask your gods for help. The fall glyph here specifically makes reference to being killed or being knocked down dead. You can also see a glyph of an upside down boat here. Quote, "The powerful, precious Horus protected God's servant by his light during the dark moment." End quote. Now, this is essentially one of the authors, in this case I think it was Nejet Sobet. He's linking himself with his god, who was Horus. He's thanking him for saving him during this dark moment. He calls himself specifically the Neterhem, which essentially means servant of Horus. This is basically gratitude to the gods for saving his life. Quote, "God will keep the hidden burial from being reached and give the foreign land heritage." End quote. What this essentially tells you is that the site was being prepared or was being used as a burial for those who died in the shipwreck. And they're also giving the land the Egyptian heritage, the traditions. They're giving them the same sort of homeland, a touch of Egypt, if you like, for the afterlife. Quote, "Eternal life to the deceased will be given power in this place." End quote. So again, this is invoking the death and religious traditions of the dynastic Egyptians, and we could be talking about a singular or a multiple burial. It doesn't really make it clear which one it is, but both cases existed in ancient Egypt, although it was more often the single one. But in this case, given the circumstances that most of the crew died and only a couple of survivors, it seems to me that it's more likely that it's a multiple burial. So that's a significant chapter of the writing that's on the right-hand side wall at Gosford, and it took Yusuf and Muhammad a lot of their own time and effort in order to do this. No one was paying them to do it. They have said that they do intend to work on the rest of the translation in the future, but like everyone, I'm sure they're also very busy with business, family, and daily life. So now let's take a look at the other side of this coin. This site has been talked about as a hoax for decades, and it's routinely scoffed at by academics and Egyptologists. Given the nature of the glyphs and the nature of this recent translation, I think we can rule out the idea that it's just a random prank made up of, just a random assortment of glyphs. In fact, this whole canyon was reportedly at one point completely filled with rubble and rocks, and it had to be emptied. Now, if I were pranking the public, I wouldn't really care about erosion, and I wouldn't want to hide my stunt away in some obscure and difficult location. I'd want to see the results of my prank and have my work noticed in, let's say, within 10 to 20 years. So I'd carve these in a much more visible and more public location, and who cares about erosion over time? Now, you can't rule out the idea that the site has been tampered with, and in fact, I think that it definitely has been. There are some indications of modern vandalism, pretty typical Australian work enhancing the dick glyph like it's some sort of high school toilet block, and there are pictures from the 80s that show that parts of the site have in fact been altered. These alterations are notably to the large figure, this carving of Anubis, and not to the glyphs themselves, and this is an important distinction. I looked closely at the carving of the large Anubis, and it does not seem to have the same patina or growth as the actual written language portions of the site. So I certainly think that there's some nuances here. It's not all black and white. It's not all a case of it's all genuine or it's all fake. I think the answer is somewhere in between. Also, the glyphs or the written language part of the site are primarily carved into the upper walls. You would need scaffolding, or at least a ladder to get up there. The known altered parts of this site, like the large Anubis, are at the ground level, and they're easily accessible to anyone with a penknife. And no advanced hieroglyphic knowledge is necessary to do this, just a mild artistic talent and a disregard for anything remotely sacred in the world. I briefly before mentioned this earlier translation that was done. You can easily find it for yourself on the internet. This translation tells some sort of Wilbur Smith river god-esque story of the tombs of the sons of Khufu, the princes who were somehow on the ship and then they died and were interred in Australia. The basis for this translation may well be the fact that the cartouches of both Seneferu and Khufu, or Cheops if you prefer it Greek, are represented on the walls at this site, and I expect that this is the source for the earlier Old Kingdom dating. Sneferu and Khufu were the early rulers of the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, but this really doesn't rule out Yusuf and Muhammad's dating of the site to around 500 BC, or even later, as Seneferu and particularly Khufu were some of the most respected and revered pharaohs of all of ancient Egypt. They were mentioned constantly throughout the civilization. We have examples of their names being used right down through to the 26th dynasty, and in fact it's from 26th dynasty tombs at Abydos that the only statue of Khufu has ever been found. This is the tiny 4-inch figure that's on display in the Cairo Museum. We find Khufu's name carved into mines from Egypt to Sudan, so it's no real surprise to also find it represented at the Gosford glyphs. Ultimately, this is one of those historical mysteries that will likely never be 100% settled in either direction. It's always going to be controversial. This site has many different accounts, stories, claims, and it's really quite the tale. Despite this, in my mind, it comes down to what is the more plausible story, when we take a look at the known and provable context and facts, and then we apply some basic logic. So, on one hand, you have the dynastic Egyptians, an ancient seafaring culture known to make large ocean-going vessels, doing this for thousands of years, and of which we have some real examples, like the solar boat next to the pyramid. There are documented records of this culture doing exactly that, sailing oceans and trading with other ancient cultures all around the world. They had connections to the ancient Aboriginal Australian culture that you can see for yourself in the museums, all of the boomerangs. And this expedition might have been exploring the world, or they even might have been on a regular trade route and were shipwrecked by bad weather. Now, this is a day wrecker, but it definitely happens. The few survivors of this storm marked their presence and the event, and they marked the passing of their fellows as best they could in the language of the day, likely with some help from the local inhabitants. No high technology required. We're not talking about lost ancient high civilizations here, just the logical extension of the known facts of an existing and well-known ancient culture. The translation of a large part of the Gosford glyphs is publicly available, symbol by symbol, for anyone that wants to follow along with a hieroglyphic dictionary and verify it for themselves. The style of these glyphs matches the dating made by the experts of somewhere around 500 BC. If this story is indeed true, then it opens up new avenues of research into what we think we know about ancient cultures and how far they travelled. If indeed this story is true, then this is a truly remarkable find, and the site should be studied and protected, as sadly there is clear evidence of both alterations and vandalism to the work on the site today.